Even the maid should know her place, Ethan Caldwell said, his voice smooth and cold as the crystal glass in his hand. And the laughter that followed wasn't loud, but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz drifting across the ballroom. Under the warm chandelier light, dozens of polished shoes shifted on marble floors as heads turned just enough to watch without seeming obvious. Because no one ever wanted to be the center of a moment like this unless they were the one in control, and Ethan always was. The room smelled faintly of aged bourbon and expensive perfume, the kind that lingered in the air like status itself, invisible but undeniable. And at the edge of it all stood Naomi Carter, dressed in a simple black uniform that blended into the background by design. A silver tray balanced steadily in her hands, as if nothing in the world had changed. A drop of red wine slid slowly from the rim of Ethan's glass and landed on the back of her hand, warm for a second before cooling against her skin, and he didn't apologize, didn't even look surprised, just tilted his head slightly like a man observing a minor inconvenience in his otherwise perfect evening. "Clean it," he added, not louder, just firmer, the kind of tone that assumed obedience the way gravity assumes falling. A few guests exchanged glances, subtle, practiced, the kind that said they noticed but would never intervene. Because this wasn't their moment, and more importantly, it wasn't their risk. Naomi didn't move right away, and that pause, barely a second, stretched longer than it should have, like the air itself had thickened around her. Her fingers tightened just slightly beneath the tray, the metal cool against her palm, grounding her, while the reflection of the chandelier fractured across its surface into a dozen small suns. She lowered the tray carefully onto a nearby table, the soft clink almost lost beneath the music. And for the first time, she looked directly at Ethan, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, like someone measuring a distance no one else could see. Up close, his suit was immaculate, tailored within an inch of perfection, the cuff of his sleeve resting exactly a quarter-inch above his watch. Everything about him calculated, controlled. "Owned, sir," she said quietly, her voice even, carrying just enough to reach him without inviting the room. "Are you sure?" And something about the question, not the words but the calm behind them, made the man beside Ethan shift his weight and glance down at his drink. Ethan let out a small laugh, not amused, just dismissive, and leaned in a fraction closer, lowering his voice as if granting her the courtesy of privacy while ensuring she understood her place. "I don't repeat myself," he said, and straightened again, already turning slightly toward his guests as if the matter were settled. But Naomi didn't bend, didn't reach for the napkin folded neatly beside the tray, didn't rush to erase the stain before it spread. She simply stood there for another heartbeat, her posture unchanged, the faint hum of the room pressing in around her. And in that stillness, something subtle shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between expectation and reality, where control begins to slip before anyone is ready to see it. The silence did not break immediately, but it changed shape, shifting from polite background noise into something tighter, more aware, as if the room itself had started paying attention without admitting it. Naomi Carter lowered her gaze only slightly, not in submission but in thought, her eyes catching the reflection of the marble floor beneath her, polished to a mirror that showed fragments of heels, cuffs, and movement without ever revealing a full picture. And for a moment she seemed to stand outside of it all, untouched by the quiet tension building around her. Earlier that evening, before the first guests arrived, and before the music softened the edges of the space, she had walked those same floors alone, her footsteps measured, her hands steady as she checked every detail with a precision that no one had asked for and no one had noticed, because people rarely noticed what worked perfectly. She had adjusted the angle of a chair by less than an inch, straightened a centerpiece that leaned just enough to feel wrong, and paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, where the skyline stretched in clean lines and cold light, each building a symbol of power, ownership, and control. She had stood there longer than necessary, her reflection faint against the glass, blending into the night beyond, as if she belonged to neither world completely. A voice from the kitchen had called her name then, sharp and practical, pulling her back into motion, and she had turned without hesitation, picking up the tray that now sat beside her again. The same tray, the same weight, but a different moment entirely. Back in the present, the faint hum of conversation resumed in careful fragments. A man near the bar clearing his throat, a woman adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. Small gestures that tried to smooth over what had just happened without confronting it. Ethan Caldwell did not look at Naomi again. Not yet. His attention already drifting to the group of investors gathered near the center of the room. His posture relaxed, confident, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. He spoke in low, measured tones about projections, acquisitions, numbers that moved like chess pieces in a game only he controlled, and the people around him listened, nodding, smiling, aligning themselves with his certainty. Naomi reached for a clean linen cloth from the table, her fingers brushing the fabric lightly, feeling its texture, the weave tight and deliberate. And for a second, she simply held it there without moving toward him, her breath steady, her shoulders relaxed, as if the decision to act or not act carried more weight than anyone else could understand. She turned slightly, not toward Ethan, but toward the long corridor that led away from the ballroom, where the light dimmed into a cooler tone and the sounds of the party faded into a distant echo. And in that direction, beyond the doors and the glass and the polished surfaces, something else waited, something quieter but far more consequential. A staff member passed behind her, whispering to another about the schedule for the next course, their voices quick and focused, unaware of the shift unfolding inches away. Naomi placed the cloth back down exactly where she had found it, smoothing it once with the edge of her hand, and when she straightened again, her expression had not hardened, had not changed into anger or defiance, but settled into something clearer, more defined, like a line drawn in water that somehow refused to disappear. Across the room, one of the junior executives glanced toward her, hesitated, then looked away, as if sensing something he could not name, something that did not fit into the hierarchy he understood. Ethan's voice carried again, confident, assured, outlining the future of a company he believed he commanded completely. And for a moment, everything appeared exactly as it should be. The powerful leading, the unseen serving, the system intact and unquestioned. But Naomi did not move to clean the stain, did not step forward to restore the illusion. She simply stood where she was, hands now empty, eyes calm, and in that stillness, the smallest crack formed beneath the surface of the evening, invisible to most, but already beginning to spread. Across the ballroom, the rhythm of the evening tried to recover its balance, but something subtle had already slipped out of place, like a perfectly aligned row of glasses where one had been moved just enough to catch the eye without anyone admitting it. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of a half-circle of investors, his voice smooth and practiced, explaining growth curves and expansion timelines as if the future were a document he had already signed, his hand occasionally gesturing with quiet authority, cuff catching the light with every movement, reinforcing the image he had built over years of control and certainty. The men and women around him leaned in just slightly, drawn not only by his words but by the confidence behind them, because in rooms like this, certainty was more valuable than truth. Near the far wall, Naomi Carter stepped away from the tray she had set down, her movement unhurried, almost invisible, as if she were following a rhythm separate from the one filling the room. And for a moment she paused beside a narrow console table where a small digital display glowed faintly beneath a glass cover, listing the evening's agenda in clean, precise lettering, the final item marked in bold, executive authorization and transfer confirmation. Her eyes lingered on those words for less than a second before lifting again, calm, unreadable, as if she had already memorized what others had yet to fully understand. A staff supervisor approached her then, a man in his 40s with a neatly pressed uniform and a voice that stayed low even when urgency crept into it. "Naomi, we need you back near the east side. Service is about to start," he said, not unkindly but with the expectation of immediate compliance. And she nodded once, the motion small but deliberate, before turning in the direction he indicated. As she walked, the soft soles of her shoes made almost no sound against the marble, but each step felt measured, intentional, as if she were crossing not just a room but a threshold no one else could see. At the same time, Ethan accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, barely acknowledging the hand that offered it. his attention fixed on a tall man beside him who was asking about controlling interest percentages after the deal closed, and Ethan smiled, a controlled curve of the mouth that signaled reassurance. Without giving away too much, once the final authorization is processed tonight, there will be no ambiguity, he said, his tone carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, reinforcing the narrative that everything was already decided. A few feet away, a young analyst standing near the edge of the group glanced down at his tablet, scrolling through documents that mirrored the discussion, his brow tightening slightly as he reached a section he had not fully reviewed before, his finger hovering for a second before tapping to expand a clause buried deeper in the file. He did not speak, did not interrupt, but his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if something in the text had unsettled the certainty he had just heard. Naomi reached the east side of the room and stopped near a set of double doors that led to a quieter hallway, the light there cooler, more subdued, the air carrying a faint hint of polished wood and distant machinery rather than perfume and conversation. And she rested her hand briefly against the door handle without opening it, her reflection faint in the metal surface, distorted just enough to blur the line between who she appeared to be and who she actually was. Behind her, the music swelled slightly, a smooth transition into the next piece, masking the low murmur of shifting conversations, while a server passed by carrying a tray of plated appetizers, the scent of rosemary and seared meat trailing in his wake, grounding the moment in something ordinary even as the underlying tension continued to build. Ethan's voice rose again, confident, steady, outlining what he believed would be the final step in securing complete control, his words landing with the weight of expectation. But across the room, without looking back, Naomi turned the handle and stepped through the doors, leaving behind the warmth of the ballroom for the cooler silence beyond. And as the door closed softly behind her, the faint click echoed just enough to mark a transition that no one inside had yet realized had already begun. The hallway beyond the ballroom felt cooler by at least 10 degrees, the air thinner, quieter, stripped of the layered voices and polished laughter that filled the main room, and Naomi Carter walked through it with the same measured pace, her footsteps now audible and soft, even taps against the darker flooring, each one echoing just enough to mark her presence without announcing it. Overhead lights cast a clean white glow, sharper than the golden warmth behind her, revealing details that the ballroom had softened, the fine seams in the walls, the subtle texture of brushed metal panels, the precise alignment of doors spaced at equal intervals along the corridor, everything here built for function rather than display. She passed a wall-mounted screen showing internal schedules and system statuses, lines of text scrolling in quiet order, and for a brief moment her reflection crossed over the data, merging with it before moving on. At the end of the hall, a set of reinforced glass doors stood closed, beyond them a conference room lit but empty of conversation, a long table waiting beneath recessed lighting, chairs perfectly aligned, a single folder placed at the center as if it had been positioned with intention rather than convenience. Naomi slowed as she approached, her hand rising not with hesitation but with certainty, and she pressed her palm lightly against the access panel beside the door, the surface cool and smooth beneath her skin. There was a soft tone, barely audible, followed by a green indicator that blinked once before the lock disengaged with a muted click, the kind of sound that carried authority without needing volume. Inside, the room held a different kind of silence, one that was not empty but expectant, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to begin. Naomi stepped in and let the door close behind her, sealing off the faint echo of the party. And for a second she stood still, her eyes scanning the table, the folder, the digital tablet resting beside it, all arranged in quiet precision. She moved forward and placed her hand on the back of one of the chairs, feeling the smooth leather beneath her fingers, grounding herself in the physical space, then pulled it out slightly and sat down, her posture straight, composed, no trace of the servant role she had carried just minutes before. She opened the folder without rush, flipping to the marked section with practiced ease, her eyes moving across the lines of legal language, clauses layered with intention, each word carrying weight that most people in the ballroom had not taken the time to fully understand. Meanwhile, back in the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell lifted his glass, slightly as if to punctuate a point, his confidence unchanged, his narrative uninterrupted. "Tonight is simply a formality," he said, his voice steady, drawing a few approving nods from those around him. Because formality implied inevitability, and inevitability was comforting to those who had already aligned themselves with his outcome. The young analyst from earlier hesitated again, his thumb hovering over the tablet screen, the claws still open, the language dense but clear enough to raise a question he was not sure he had the authority to ask, and he glanced toward Ethan, then back at the screen, the conflict quiet but real. In the conference room, Naomi reached for the tablet and activated it with a single touch, the display illuminating her face in a cooler light, the interface clean, waiting for input, and she scrolled to the authorization section, her name appearing in precise lettering, Naomi Carter, positioned not as an observer, but as the final approving authority. Her finger paused above the screen, not out of doubt, but as if acknowledging the weight of the action about to be taken, the culmination of decisions made long before this night had begun. Outside the room, footsteps approached, steady, deliberate, the faint sound growing closer along the corridor, and a shadow passed briefly across the frosted glass, signaling that she was no longer alone in this moment, that others were arriving to witness what was about to unfold. Inside, Naomi lifted her gaze from the tablet, her expression unchanged, calm, centered, as the door handle turned slowly, and the next phase of the evening, one that the ballroom had not anticipated, began to take shape just beyond the threshold. The door opened with a quiet precision, and 3 figures stepped into the conference room, their presence carrying a different kind of authority than the noise of the ballroom, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt. The first was a gray-haired man in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his expression composed, followed by a woman holding a slim folder against her chest, and another man with a tablet already in hand, each of them moving with the calm efficiency of people who understood exactly why they were there. Naomi Carter did not rise immediately, her gaze steady as she acknowledged them with a slight nod, as if this moment had been scheduled long before any of them had entered the building that night. "Ms. Carter," the older man said, his voice low but clear, carrying a note of respect that contrasted sharply with the tone she had heard minutes earlier, and he took a seat across from her without hesitation, placing his hands neatly on the table as the others settled into their positions. The woman opened her folder, aligning the documents with careful precision, while the man with the tablet tapped the screen lightly, bringing up a set of files that mirrored the ones Naomi had already reviewed. Outside the room, the hallway remained quiet, but beyond it, the ballroom continued its performance of certainty, unaware that the center of gravity had already shifted. Inside, Naomi turned the tablet slightly toward the group, the glow reflecting in her eyes, calm and focused, and for a brief moment no one spoke, the silence holding the weight of what was about to be confirmed. Then the older man inclined his head slightly, a subtle signal, and said, "We are ready to proceed with final authorization," his words measured, formal, leaving no room for interpretation. Naomi's finger hovered above the confirmation field again, not out of hesitation, but as if marking the exact point where intention becomes irreversible action, and she glanced once at the digital timestamp in the corner of the screen, the numbers steady, precise, counting forward without concern for what they would soon record. Back in the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell accepted a handshake from one of the investors, his confidence unwavering, his smile controlled, as he spoke about expansion into new markets, his voice blending seamlessly with the low hum of agreement around him. The young analyst, still near the edge of the group, finally took a step forward, his movement small but noticeable enough to draw a brief glance from one of the senior executives, and he leaned slightly toward him, lowering his voice. "There is a clause in the authorization section that," he began, but the executive lifted a hand gently, cutting him off with a polite but firm gesture. "Everything has been reviewed," he said, his tone dismissive, not unkind but final, and the analyst hesitated, his words fading before they could fully form. In the conference room, Naomi pressed her finger to the screen, the contact light and deliberate, and the system responded instantly, the interface shifting as the authorization processed, a quiet confirmation tone marking the completion of something far larger than the sound suggested. The man with the tablet glanced down, his eyes scanning the update as it appeared in real time, and the woman beside him adjusted the documents, aligning them with the new status as if the physical papers needed to catch up with what had already changed digitally. The older man allowed himself a small, controlled breath, not relief, but acknowledgement, and looked back at Naomi. "It is done," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality without needing emphasis. Naomi did not react outwardly, her expression remaining composed, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet settling, as if a role she had carried no longer needed to be maintained. In the ballroom, Ethan lifted his glass again, unaware that the structure he believed he controlled had just been redefined without him. His reflection in the polished surface of the glass steady and confident, while somewhere beyond the walls, the reality beneath that reflection had already changed. In the conference room, Naomi closed the folder gently, the soft sound of paper against paper marking the end of one phase and the beginning of another, and as she stood, smoothing the front of her uniform with a single, precise motion, the contrast between who she had appeared to be and who she now fully was no longer needed to be hidden, even if the rest of the building had not yet caught up to the truth. The room did not celebrate, it did not shift into noise or relief. It simply settled into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone. And Naomi Carter stood still for a moment after closing the folder, her hand resting lightly on its surface as if acknowledging the weight of everything that had just been confirmed. The overhead lights cast a steady glow across the polished table, reflecting clean lines and still figures. And in that reflection, she no longer blended into the background, no longer part of the unnoticed movement that supported the room from its edges. She was now centered within it, defined not by uniform, but by authority that required no announcement. The older man across from her adjusted his posture slightly, a subtle gesture of respect, not exaggerated, not performative, just present, and the woman beside him closed her folder with a quiet, precise motion, aligning its edges with the table as if order itself mattered more now than it had minutes before. No one rushed to speak, because there was nothing urgent left to confirm, only the quiet understanding that the structure of power in the building had already shifted, even if the ballroom continued to echo with confidence that had not yet caught up. Naomi exhaled slowly, not from tension, but from completion, her breath steady, controlled, and she turned her gaze briefly toward the frosted glass doors, where the blurred shapes of the hallway lights moved faintly, reminding her that the rest of the night still waited on the other side. Inside her mind, there was no triumph, no surge of satisfaction, only a clear, grounded awareness of what had been set into motion and what would follow, because this moment had never been about proving someone wrong. It had always been about restoring something that had been overlooked, misread, and quietly taken for granted. She reached down and adjusted the sleeve of her uniform, smoothing the fabric with a single motion, the gesture small but intentional, as if acknowledging that even the role she had worn carried its own kind of dignity, one that had been tested but never lost. The man with the tablet cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but to confirm. "The system has updated across all departments," he said, his voice measured, almost reverent. And Naomi gave a slight nod, accepting the information without needing further detail. Beyond the room, faint sounds from the ballroom filtered through the walls, muted but recognizable, the rise and fall of conversation, the clink of glass against glass, the rhythm of a space still performing its version of reality, unaware that its foundation had already been rewritten. Naomi stepped away from the table and moved toward the glass doors, her footsteps calm and unhurried, each one carrying the same quiet certainty that had defined her from the beginning. And as she reached for the handle, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from reflection, as if marking the boundary between two versions of the same evening, one where she had been invisible and one where she would no longer be. Her fingers closed around the handle, the metal cool and solid beneath her grip, and she opened the door. Slowly, the soft sound of it moving breaking the stillness of the room behind her. The hallway stretched out ahead, unchanged in its appearance, but now different in meaning. Every light, every surface, every step forward aligned with a truth that had already been secured. Naomi walked forward, her reflection appearing briefly in the glass panels along the corridor, clearer now, more defined. No longer merging into the background, but standing apart from it. Behind her, the conference room remained quiet, its purpose fulfilled, its silence complete, and ahead, the distant warmth of the ballroom waited, still filled with voices that had not yet realized the shift that had already taken place. Naomi did not quicken her pace, did not prepare for confrontation. She simply continued forward, steady, composed, carrying with her a presence that no longer needed permission to be seen. And as she moved closer to the doors that would lead her back into the center of it all, the faint echo of earlier laughter lingered in the air ahead, thinner now, less certain, as if even without knowing why, the room was already beginning to feel the change approaching. The ballroom doors opened with a quiet ease, and Naomi Carter stepped back into the warm glow of chandelier light, as if she had never left. Yet something in the air shifted almost immediately, subtle but undeniable, like a change in pressure before a storm that no one could yet see. Conversations continued, glasses still clinked, but a few heads turned without knowing why, eyes catching her movement as she walked across the marble floor with the same measured pace, her posture unchanged yet, somehow no longer blending into the edges of the room. Across the space, Ethan Caldwell was mid-sentence, his voice steady as he outlined projections with confident precision, but his gaze flickered for just a fraction of a second when he noticed her returning, the briefest interruption in his rhythm, quickly masked as he continued speaking, unwilling to let anything disrupt the narrative he had built. Naomi did not rush, did not seek attention. She simply moved through the room with quiet intention, passing servers and guests alike, her presence drawing a subtle path of awareness behind her, until she reached the central area where Ethan stood. And then she stopped, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be seen. A pause followed, small at first, like a skipped beat in music, and one of the investors turned his head slightly, noticing the stillness where there should have been movement, his eyes shifting from Naomi to Ethan and back again. Ethan finished his sentence, the last word landing with practiced confidence, and only then did he allow his attention to settle fully on her, his expression tightening just slightly, not in anger, but in controlled impatience, as if he expected compliance that had been delayed long enough. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his tone low, measured, the same tone he used to address minor inconveniences, and a few nearby guests fell quiet, sensing the edge beneath the calm. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice calm and clear when she spoke. "Yes," she said, not raising her volume. Yet the word carried further than expected, cutting gently through the surrounding noise. Another pause followed, longer this time, the kind that made people shift their weight and glance at one another without speaking. From the far side of the room, the gray-haired man from the conference room entered quietly, accompanied by the woman with the folder and the man with the tablet, their presence moving with purpose, not hurried but direct, and as they approached, a few more conversations began to fade, the ripple of attention spreading outward. Ethan's posture straightened slightly, recognition flickering in his eyes as he registered the approaching figures, men and women he knew by reputation if not by frequent contact, individuals who did not appear in rooms without reason. The older man stopped a few feet from Naomi, his gaze shifting briefly to Ethan before returning to her, and then, in a tone that carried unmistakable clarity, he said, "Ms. Carter, everything has been finalized." And the words landed with a weight that silenced the immediate space around them. For a second, Ethan did not react, the statement not aligning with the structure he believed he understood, and he let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh. "I think there is some confusion," he said, his voice controlled but edged now with something sharper. "You should direct that to the appropriate." But he stopped, not because he chose to, but because the man with the tablet stepped forward slightly and turned the screen toward him, the display bright under the chandelier light, showing the updated authorization, the ownership structure, the final approval line, and at the center of it, clear and undeniable, the name Naomi Carter. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp loudly. It simply went still, the kind of stillness that absorbs sound rather than releases it, and Ethan's eyes moved across the screen once, Then again, slower this time. As if reading the same line twice might change it, but it did not. Naomi did not speak immediately, did not step forward or back. She simply stood there, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, allowing the truth to settle into the space without force. The investors who had stood beside Ethan moments earlier shifted subtly, their alignment no longer as firm, their attention recalibrating in real time as the structure they had trusted revealed a different foundation. Ethan lowered his hand slightly, the glass he held catching the light as it tilted just enough to reflect the room back at him. Distorted now, unfamiliar, and for the first time that evening, his certainty did not return right away. Naomi held his gaze, not with triumph, not with judgment, but with a quiet clarity that made the moment impossible to dismiss. And in that silence, the balance of the room shifted completely, not through volume or force, but through the simple, undeniable presence of truth revealed. For a long second, no one moved, as if the room itself had forgotten how to continue, and Ethan Caldwell stood there with the tablet still angled toward him, the glow reflecting faintly across his face, his eyes fixed on the name that refused to change no matter how many times he looked at it. The confidence that had carried him through the evening did not disappear all at once. It thinned, piece by piece, like a structure losing support from within, until what remained was not authority but uncertainty carefully trying to hold its shape. He lowered the glass in his hand slowly, placing it onto a nearby table with more care than before, the soft contact against the surface louder than it should have been in the quiet. And when he looked back up, his gaze met Naomi Carter again, but this time without the dismissive edge, without the assumption that had defined every word he had spoken to her earlier. The investors around them shifted subtly, creating space. Without realizing it, their attention no longer anchored to Ethan but moving toward Naomi, recalibrating, adjusting, as if the invisible lines of power in the room had been redrawn in real time. The older man stepped slightly to the side, not to lead but to allow the moment to settle between the two central figures, and the woman with the folder held it close, her posture composed, her eyes attentive, observing the transition not with surprise but with recognition. Ethan inhaled, a controlled breath, then another, as if measuring his words before allowing them to exist. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. "I was not aware," he said, the sentence incomplete but heavy with implication, an acknowledgement that did not attempt to explain, only to bridge the gap between what he believed and what was now undeniable. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, measured, carrying no trace of anger. "That is clear," she said, the words simple, but their meaning layered with everything that had just unfolded. Another silence followed, not tense, not explosive, but reflective, the kind that forces those within it to confront what has shifted. Ethan's hand moved slightly, as if he might gesture, might reclaim control through motion, but it stopped halfway, hovering before settling back at his side, the instinct checked by a realization that control no longer belonged to him in the way it had minutes before. He glanced briefly at the people around him, the same individuals who had nodded along to his certainty earlier, and saw something different in their eyes now. Not rejection, not yet, but distance, a careful reassessment of where they stood and who they followed. When his gaze returned to Naomi, it held something new, not respect fully formed, but the beginning of it, shaped by the absence of everything that had come before. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words deliberate, not rushed, and though they were spoken quietly, they carried further than any of his earlier statements, because they were no longer supported by status, only by necessity. Naomi did not respond immediately, allowing the words to exist in the space between them, to settle without interruption. And then she gave a slight nod, not as acceptance of guilt, but as acknowledgement of truth. "What you owe," she said softly, her tone even, "is understanding." And the room seemed to absorb that sentence differently, not as a correction, but as a redefinition of what mattered. Ethan held her gaze, the meaning of her words unfolding slowly, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to see beyond the moment he had created. And for the first time that evening, he did not look away, around them. The ballroom remained quiet, the music still playing but distant, as if it belonged to another space entirely. And the people who had once filled it with conversation now stood within a different kind of awareness, one that required no announcement. Naomi turned slightly then, not dismissing him, not ending the exchange abruptly, but shifting her focus toward the room as a whole, her presence steady, grounded, and in that movement, it became clear that the moment was no longer about a single apology or a single mistake. It was about the quiet, undeniable shift that had taken place, one that no one in the room could ignore, even if they did not yet fully understand it. The room did not return to what it had been, not fully, not even as the music continued and a few voices cautiously resumed, because something deeper than sound had changed, something that could not be restored by conversation or polished smiles. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, without claiming the space, without demanding attention, simply existing within it with a quiet certainty that reshaped everything around her. The chandelier light reflected softly along the marble floor, tracing a path that led from where she had stood as an invisible figure to where she now stood as the axis of the room's attention. And in that reflection, the difference was not in appearance, but in recognition. Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment longer, his posture no longer commanding the same gravity, his shoulders held with care rather than dominance. And when he finally stepped back, it was not a retreat, but a recalibration, a small shift that acknowledged the new structure without words. The investors nearby adjusted their positions subtly, their alignment no longer instinctively tied to him, their focus drifting toward Naomi with a quiet, collective awareness that authority had found a different center. No announcement followed, no declaration of roles or titles, because none was needed. The truth had already been seen, and once seen, it did not require repetition. Naomi turned and began to walk across the room, not toward the exit, not away from anyone, but through the space itself, her steps steady, unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble now distinct, no longer blending into the background, but marking a presence that carried weight without force. As she passed a mirrored column, her reflection appeared beside her, clear and uninterrupted, no longer fractured by angles or hidden in shadow. And for a brief second, the image held, a quiet confirmation of identity fully revealed. A server standing near the edge of the room instinctively stepped aside, not out of instruction but recognition, and a guest who had earlier avoided eye contact now watched her pass with a different expression, one that held respect where indifference had once been, near the far side of the ballroom. The glass doors reflected the city beyond, lights stretching into the distance, each one steady, each one part of a larger pattern that existed whether anyone noticed it or not. And Naomi slowed as she reached that edge, her gaze lifting slightly toward the skyline, as if measuring something beyond the room itself. Behind her, the conversation had shifted, quieter now, more measured, as if the people within it were choosing their words with greater care, aware that the assumptions they had carried into the evening no longer held the same certainty. Ethan remained where he was, his eyes following her movement, not with challenge, not with resistance, but with a recognition that had arrived too late to prevent the moment, yet not too late to learn from it. His hand rested lightly against the back of a chair, fingers still, as if grounding himself in a space that no longer responded to him in the same way. And he did not speak again, because there was nothing he could say that would alter what had already been revealed. Naomi placed her hand briefly against the cool glass of the door, the surface smooth beneath her palm, the city lights reflecting faintly across her fingers, and then she let it rest there for just a second longer than necessary, not as a gesture for others to see, but as a quiet pause, a moment of stillness that belonged only to her. She turned slightly back toward the room, her gaze passing over the faces that now watched her differently, not seeking approval, not offering judgment, simply acknowledging their presence before letting the moment settle into silence. No final words were spoken, no dramatic gesture followed, only the soft hum of the evening continuing around a truth that had already taken its place. And as Naomi stood there, calm and unshaken, the space itself seemed to adjust, aligning not with power declared, but with dignity quietly held, leaving behind a silence that did not feel empty, but complete.